So I've just discussed some of the key concepts and themes, goals that emerge in this text, right? What makes this ethnography stand out from some of the others that we've read this semester. And now I'd like us to look at some of the theoretical concepts ideas that our ethnographers here use in Righteous Dope Fiend. And the first is the gray zone. This is a term that they use regularly throughout, certainly the introduction. And so I'd like to ask you, what do Bourgeois and Schonberg mean by the gray zone? What is this referring to? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to flip to, or virtually flip to, page 1920. Go ahead and pause this video and see if you can find where they discuss the gray zone. So these are spaces in which human survival is the primary and main goal. This is a concept that comes to us from Primo Levi, philosopher, thinker, writer on the experience of the Holocaust, which we lived through. And so they're not saying that being an unhoused person in California is the same as going through the Holocaust. No, but they are making this kind of argument that at least there might be one thing that's similar. It's that their interlocutors are really struggling to simply survive in the streets. And you'll see this as you continue to read other chapters in the text, and you see some of the medical complications that these folks have to live with. So yes, again, they're not comparing homelessness or what it means to be an unhoused person as to what it means to have lived through the Holocaust, but there are some structural similarities. For example, and of course they're using the interlocutor's words in this ethnography. One interlocutor says, "No one put a gun to my head and made me shoot heroin." So again, they're kind of arguing that, like this, the interlocutors themselves, unhoused persons, are like, hey, there are various reasons that brought me to this lived experience, and I don't want to be made to be a victim, right? As essentially, the sentiment that comes behind that statement. Throughout, Bourgeois and Schonberg argue that there are actually moments of joy, right, and friendship and camaraderie that emerge in the lives of the Edgewater homeless, right? In other words, their lives aren't completely devoid of joy. Again, part of that's the act of humanizing people, right? No matter what lived circumstances you might find yourself in, you're still going to try to maintain some sense of normalcy, some sense of of what it, otherwise, what is the point of going on, right? They write on page 20, by extending the boundaries of the Holocaust's gray zone to the everyday world around us in California, we understand that the Edgewater homeless, understand the Edgewater homeless is surviving along an especially coercive and desperate swath of the gray zone continuum, right? So this idea that there's a gray zone continuum from all the way to the extreme to something like the Holocaust to maybe something somewhat less extreme, like what it means to be an unhoused person in California, right? They can see these structural forces, right, that are really impacting humans' ability to survive, to live a good life, right? It's essentially made impossible for them. So that's the first concept that I want you to think about as you read this text, is the gray zone, right? Again, this is not a concept they come up with. They're borrowing this from a philosopher who writes about the Holocaust, but they're applying it to this ethnographic context. And as I've said, when we read Made in Madagascar, for example, right, and talked about the gift, anthropologists, cultural anthropologists use theories, social theory, like we draw from folks like Marcel Mauss, who write about the gift. Here they're drawing from Primo Levi, who wrote about the gray zone. And we use those theories to think about what we see or experience when we're doing field work. Okay, so that's the first kind of difficult concept, is the gray zone. Now let's turn to the lumpen proletariat, that is. This might be this might have been a moment in the intro of the text when you thought, oh my gosh, this is so confusing. I don't understand what they're talking about. That's okay. That's why I'm lecturing on it for you. The lumpen proletariat. This is a concept that comes to us from Karl Marx. I imagine, I hope, certainly some of you know who Karl Marx is. We think of Karl Marx as being, fighting for the working class, right? That's Marxism, right? The idea behind the work of Marx and Engels. So as you can see, I've written here from Karl Marx, the lumpen proletariat is the underclass, the lowest kind of class in capitalism. This class kind of finds it impossible to earn a living legitimately. And so they have to resort to illegitimate or illegal means of subsistence. So again, we think of Karl Marx as, hey, these are the people who are fighting for the working class, right? Want to, challenge, violent forms of capitalism, right? Play Robin Hood, that sort of thing. Well, actually, Marx and Engels refer to the lumpen proletariat in very disparaging terms. For Marx, a lumpen proletariat is frankly bad. They referred to the lumpen proletariat as, quote, this scum of depraved elements of all classes. So actually, Marx is not fighting for the lumpen proletariat. He sees them as literally, quote, scum. The lumpen proletariat for Marx, these are people who are not simply unemployed, but they're unemployed for so long that it becomes really kind of ingrained in a part of their identity. It becomes central to their way of life and what we would refer to in anthropology and the humanities and social sciences as their subjectivity. So Bourgeois and Schonberg in this book want to say, hey, we need to destigmatize, or we want to destigmatize the idea of a lumpen proletariat, right? Marx calls them scum. We want to say, why are we referring to them as scum, right? That's problematic for several reasons, which they kind of outline in the text as you read. It's interesting to think about how the lumpen proletariat, this kind of concept and category, has been used and taken up, or kind of used as a self-identifier for various groups throughout history, including the Black Panthers and others who also saw themselves as a part of this stigmatized underclass. So this is not the first time that the lumpen proletariat has kind of entered or been used to describe a class in the United States. So I want to kind of test you on this idea of the lumpen proletariat as I've just described it to you. Can you apply this concept to other groups, other marginalized groups in the United States? It's important here to note that, again, the lumpen proletariat, these are folks who are unable to find legitimate employment, right? They're such an extreme underclass that it becomes nearly impossible for them to be employed. Right? Almost legally speaking, difficult, right? For various legal reasons. For example, if you're unhoused, right, how do you give an address, right, when you're applying for jobs, this sort of thing? So I have two questions for you. First, would you count the status of quote unquote undocumented immigrants as being members of a lumpen community? Again, would you count the status of undocumented immigrants as making them, be a part of this lumpen community? What do you think? Take a second to reflect on that. What about the transgender population in the United States? Does that make them a part of the lumpen proletariat? Well, technically speaking, right, to be a part of, to be an undocumented immigrant means that you cannot legally seek employment in the United States. So yes, the first question, that group would be seen, according to Marx, as a part of the lumpen proletariat. The transgender community experiences incredible levels of discrimination in employment and, as a result, economic disenfranchisement, right? But they're not categorically banned from seeking employment, right? Like, as long as they are quote unquote, have documentation or legal, just like any other American citizen or a permanent resident or someone with a green card, right? They can legally seek employment just like anyone else. So the answer to that second question is no, they wouldn't technically be considered part of the lumpen proletariat. But part of what I want to stress here, right, is that even if you aren't technically a part of the lumpen proletariat, you can still experience very serious discrimination in terms of employment. So again, being part of the lumpen proletariat means that you are so marginalized that you're almost completely prevented from seeking employment. You're seen as a part of this underclass, and you live with very extreme stigma because of that. Okay, now I'm going to introduce one concept, one of two, and that is the concept of agency. I have introduced this concept briefly several times already in this course. Agency are conscious thoughts or actions that an individual undertakes in order to express their voice or their power or act upon the world more generally. Okay, all individuals have the capacity for agency on some level, right? So it might be certainly greatly reduced in certain circumstances. This is, in other words, the ability to act upon the world. I have a longer definition here: an individual's abilities to reflect systematically on taken for granted cultural practices, to imagine alternatives, and to take independent actions or decisions. So in some ways, as we learn about cultural relativism, as you did throughout this semester, remember that I said the very first day of class, that is one of the most, if not the most important concept in this entire course throughout that you'll learn this semester. We're enacting agency as we practice cultural relativism, because it means that we have the ability to reflect on our own thoughts and behaviors, right? On things that we typically take for granted or see as normal, right? Hopefully this course has taught you, by looking at a variety of global examples, that you may have long taken for granted as normal or right or correct isn't right in the eyes of someone else. So why do I have this picture here of traffic? Well, I really find that the analogy of driving can be helpful for students as they're trying to learn the concept of agency. Think about agency as the act of an individual driver, right? Each driver has certain level of freedom, right, in terms of how they're driving, decisions they make while they're driving, but they're always restricted by the rules of the laws that guide all of us as we drive, right? And also by the actions that other drivers on the road make, right? So again, in this case, the agency is the individual driver, their ability to make decisions about how they drive in certain circumstances. Okay, I will now continue this we will now continue this lecture onto a third video.